Hello friends, good morning and welcome to The Rational Independent. My name is Nathan Lindorf and today we're going to do a Reddit rant. For today we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to get into some reporting by The Telegraph on the Ukraine war and some recent comments by President Trump. Headline, quote, Donald Trump, I'd have let Putin annex part of Ukraine to end the war. Now here's what's interesting. As is implied by the name, this is a Reddit rant. What I do is I go to r/politics. I grab one of the top, if not the top articles there, and we discuss it. Now, here's what's interesting. On Reddit, the headline says, Donald Trump, I'd have let Putin annex Ukraine to end the war. It's amazing in reporting how just shifting a couple of words changes the context completely. Because when I read that post in Reddit, when I read that headline, it's saying that President Trump, is stating as a policy position that he would have negotiated to let Russia reclaim all of Ukraine, beginning to reincorporate the USSR or whatever you want to call it as a vassal state, whatever. But the actual headline from The Telegraph says, I'd have let Putin annex part of the Ukraine. And as we'll get into, President Trump elaborates on that and says there are certain parts of Ukraine that are Russian-speaking, that are culturally Russian, that when you poll them, they seem to vote and say, we'd like to be part of Russia. I am an American. I do not have tremendous insight. It should be noted, I'm American. I do not have tremendous insight into local Ukrainian politics or the ins and outs of the specific details on different regions. I'm not going to pretend to that level of competency. I'm an outside observer attempting to just analyze the situation as best I can given limited information, because that's how most of American citizens are making their decisions, whether they support different politicians in different endeavors. I will say that there's a material difference between proposing to let Russia reincorporate a whole country versus Russia to incorporate a portion of that country because it appears to identify more closely with Russia than it does with Ukraine. Facts aside about exactly what's going on the ground, setting that aside, the concept of those two things are not identical. And yet the headline on the article is more reasonable. And it describes more accurately President Trump's position. On the flip side, on Reddit, it's not as clear. So now we've made it as far as the headline. Yay, let's get into the body and see if there's anything interesting to discuss. Donald Trump indicated he may have made a deal allowing Russia to take over parts of Ukraine to end the war if he were president at the time of invasion. And I guess this conversation occurred on a radio show with Sean Hannity. I really don't pay attention to Fox News. So something along those lines. Fox News and Trump are sitting there talking to each other, I guess Sean Hannity. And President Trump says, don't forget, under Bush, they take over Georgia. Under Obama, they took over Crimea. And under Biden, they're taking over everything. And while Trump was president, they took nothing. That's a fair point. In the sense that if you look at the last 30 years of foreign policy, every president has gotten us entangled in some sort of foreign war, foreign entanglement, anti-insurgency mission, something going on from full-scale war to regional conflict. Every single one, except for President Trump. Now, foreign policy stuff like this, sometimes that's a roll of the dice. I mean, World War II is going to happen. It's going to happen. Doesn't matter who the president is. You can't stop that. But if you are, if the timing works out, then maybe you say, hey, look, I wasn't involved in that, Not to belabor the point. But from a factual historical perspective, that's pretty true. I mean, the fact of the matter is, there are aggressive state actors out in the world. China and Russia are two of them, but not the only two, that are trying to boss around their neighbors, trying to bump around and expand their influence and bring more territory and more resources under their control. And somehow, while President Trump was president, they all kind of simmered down a little bit. Draw from that what conclusion you will. Something interesting is that President Trump is describing a policy of peace through strength. He's saying that his approach is to be strong enough that other people go, oh, I'm not going to push. I'm not going to provoke, because that'll be bad for me. That kind of deterrent policy, it has a place. There's a reason for it. But it doesn't solve every problem. Eventually, you're going to get a bully who's either desperate enough or stupid enough to push you, even when you're strong enough to squash them like a bug. And then you have to deal with the after effect of that. I mean, if you look at it, President Obama had a moment where he very famously said, we're drawing a red line that if there are chemical weapons used in Syria, that we'll consider that as a provocation for war. And then we had chemical weapons used in Syria, and we didn't go to war. We were strong enough to, militarily, but we chose not to. Now, frankly, probably the right move. I'm not a fan of entanglements in more and more foreign wars. It's not an easy yes from me. But even if it's the right move to not go into war, it's never the right move to set a boundary, to set a deterrence, and then not follow through. That's a recipe for disaster. Now, at the end of the article, we shift from discussing President Trump to talking about Speaker McCarthy. Now, I'm no fan of the general Republican establishment. I'm no fan of Kevin McCarthy. I am grateful that he allowed himself to be strong-armed by a small minority of Republicans to do things like release the January 6th footage, to reform some of the ways that spending is handled in the House. I'm really glad that happened. But that only happened essentially because they were able to hold Speaker McCarthy over the barrel. So I'm no fan of his. But here, he does describe some things that make sense. So he was asked to go and visit President Zelensky in Kiev. And he said no. He said, I'll keep getting my briefings. I'm well informed. I don't need to go and see it. And then he says, and my point has always been, this is Speaker McCarthy, I won't provide a blank check. And that is one point that I wanted to... So now we've kind of gone over the body. Let's go over some of the analysis. The Ukrainian war is a mess. It's been going on for over a year. There's a tremendous amount of casualties. There's a tremendous amount of property destruction. We have created a failed state. Huge portions of Ukraine have been shelled into oblivion. The cynic in me says, maybe that was on purpose. Because here's the thing: if the war is over tomorrow, and peace is allowed to be reestablished, someone has to rebuild after all that destruction, and that rebuilding costs money. And the Ukrainian government doesn't have that money. So where does that money come from? It comes from loans or grants from other funds or intergovernmental things or whatever. And most of the time, loans and funds like that, they come with strings. And now you've taken a free country, you've helped it fight a war, and then you wrap it up in constrained financing. And now you have a vassal state another way. I mean, the simple truth is the Russian model of dominating smaller nations makes sense. Militarily, it works, or at least it did in the past. And you can see how Putin, being kind of an old guard thinker, is trying to reestablish the glory of the USSR. And he kind of feels like he needs to conquer everything in order to make that happen. It's not always the case. And while America doesn't have an outright empire, it definitely has influence and control over a lot of different places, and a big part of that is because of the money that it provides. I mean, America funds the UN, the bulk of it. I mean, America funds the bulk of the UN and NATO. Those strings are real, and we help those countries make their decisions, and we have influence in those countries' politics because of, I mean, if you look at the foreign aid we provide alone, it's a lot of money. At the same time, if you flip around and look at there's usually a yin and yang. Look at China. Do a little Googling and check out I think it's called the Belt and Road Initiative, where basically they're saying we'd like to expand our influence around the world, and we're going to do that by paying for infrastructure. And then for those countries where we build their infrastructure, we kind of own them. Or at very least, we want a lot of influence and control and favorable treatment through trade. And look at Africa. China is moving through Africa, building infrastructure, providing loans, and embedding its cultural influence and political and trade influence in those countries. That's a reality. I guess my point is this. It's important for people to be free, but there's more than one way to enslave a people. And just because you help preserve a people from one type of dictator doesn't mean that at the end of things, they're going to be left free from a different kind of dictator, from a different kind of control. And that's regrettable. It's especially regrettable because most people don't even see it. I'll give you some numbers. Last I heard, we have spent a little over $100 billion supporting the war in Ukraine. That's a lot of stinking money. Now, here's what's interesting about that. You'd say, okay, guns and butter. All right, that's the proverbial military support. You know, we're not going to send over... I'd say we're not going to send over tanks, but I'm pretty sure we decided to send over tanks. So, I can't speak so flippantly. If you want to support a country and you don't want to directly support them militarily, you're not sending over troops, you're not directly arming them, you're not providing advanced weapons, you're not providing training, etc. One way to do that is to help fund them, because money is fungible. If you are a country fighting a war for your own independence, and you have a limited amount of funds, and with those funds you can either buy bullets or you can pave roads. If another country comes in and says, we'll pay the money to pave the roads, you say, perfect, then I can use my money to buy the bullets. And effectively, even though your ally isn't buying bullets, they're freeing funds up so that you can buy bullets. It's difficult to show the different way these pieces and levers interrelate in a short form video. But that's all we have, so we're going to do our best. So when it comes to Ukraine, we have provided $100 billion. Did you know that we are funding Ukrainian pension obligations? Did you know that's part of what we're doing with the money we're providing? We are funding civil services. We are funding all sorts of stuff. We're effectively propping up the current government. Maybe that's a good thing. Helps them function, helps them fight off Russia. Certainly not a bad thing on its surface. But did you know that's what we were doing? Had you heard that that's how the money was being spent? Probably not, because there's almost no oversight. We are just shoveling huge amounts of money because in a world of narratives, you need a bad guy and you need a sympathetic good guy, the underdog. And when the media creates the Ukrainian sympathetic underdog in this narrative, then it incentivizes politicians to all rally to the cause and, as Kevin McCarthy objected to, want to write blank checks. Well, Ukraine is one of the most corrupt governments on the planet. And by corrupt, I mean filled with people who seek to enrich themselves with government funds and government influence. So if you take a leaky, corrupt government system like this and you shove huge amounts of money into it, it shouldn't be a surprise that a big chunk of that is going to fall out into the pockets of some oligarchs. We are funding state-sponsored corruption. Our money is enriching bad actors, inevitably, because we're shoving money into a system that lacks integrity. That's the essential definition of corruption. Something that is corrupt lacks internal integrity, lacks cohesion, and makes it so that if you try and do something with it, either doesn't perform the function that it should, or it does, but it has other unintended consequences or leaks or whatever. So that's the article. That's my broad analysis. My 2 cents is pretty simple. President Trump was not a terrible president. He did some very good things in the world, not least of which he tamped down the aggression of a variety of volatile nation states around the world, at least for a time. However, for those who are saying, we just need to get Trump back in and then that will make everything better. Rah, rah, I'm on Team Trump. It doesn't solve anything. Even if you give him 4 more years. Okay, maybe Putin simmers down for 4 more years. You think China only sees 4 years ahead? No. They're thinking 30, 40 years down the road. They're making plans as this monolith for after President Trump is done. If you want to do something about that, you can't fix it by reinstalling the guy you like. We have to build into our culture and into our politics a better way of dealing with these long-term threats. One of those would be, to my mind, we need to be a lot more careful about the foreign assistance that we throw out there. It really screws things up when we just throw money around. And it creates all sorts of incentives for bad actors to cause problems. We can't be the world's policeman. We don't have the energy, we don't have the time, we don't have the money, we don't have the people. It's not a good use for us. If we're not, though, that means we have to accept that there are going to be some dictators out there that are going to do some bad stuff in the world. Everything has a trade-off. If we build a government and a standing army powerful enough to be the world's policeman, to prevent all bullies everywhere from being tyrants, we'll be the biggest tyrant on the block. Especially if we get corrupted, especially if we turn dark. If our military power turns from liberation into conquering, that gets real nasty real fast. So I have major concerns about the idea of us being the world's policeman. I think one of the best things we've ever done for world peace is not to be the world's policeman, but to export the cultural values of freedom, independence, free markets, civil society, voting, suffrage. These are key things that we can export to the world and help make the world a better place. Over the last 20 years, you may not have heard it, but the global poverty rate has plummeted. By poverty, I mean, on a global scale, I'm pretty sure poverty is defined as living on less than $2 a day. And I want to say, I should have these stats memorized, but they don't always stick. I want to say that 20 years ago, something like 60% of the world's population lived on less than $2 a day. And as of a couple of years ago, last time I looked at it, it was down to about 10%. So half the people in the world that used to live in abject poverty have been lifted out of that poverty. I don't think that was socialism that did that. I think it was innovation. I think it was technology. I think it was free market principles and capitalism. That it's the rising tide lifts all boats idea. The challenge with these videos is that I can scatter and spider plot off into a bunch of other things. I'm trying to learn how to stay a little more on task. So let's say this. My 2 cents is that Ukraine is not the good guy here, not exclusively. And Russia is not the bad guy here, not exclusively. They both have some good points in this, and they both have some bad points in it. There's a history here that goes back a long ways. And as Americans, we don't always see the whole picture because we have a very myopic, very short-term view on history because we've become so powerful over such a short period of time. But there are conflicts here that are deeply, deeply embedded. And the idea that we can solve this by shoveling money and arms on one side or the other is specious. It's foolish, almost to beggar belief. And yet, that's the path we've taken, so far at least. So once again, we have an article that is negative to Trump, misleading headline, but the quotes themselves were actually pretty on point. And they even quoted, some other related people, Speaker McCarthy, etc. Not a terrible article. A little bit of a slant, but not a terrible article. I was actually surprised. All right, that's my Reddit rant for today. Good luck out there.